Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I am your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today we have Rabbi Stephen Einstein on the podcast. Rabbi Stephen is a longtime serving rabbi, and it's probably safe to say one of the more well-known rabbis in Southern California. He has served as a rabbi for over 50 years or around 50 years in Orange County. And just going through your bio, it would probably take the entire time of the podcast to list all the different projects that you are involved in. But we are so happy that you're here. So welcome.
Well, thank you. So the first thing I will tell you is, in terms of my name, people look at that name and they're not quite sure what to do with it because they say, "Well, this can't actually be the same as my famous cousin." And so they say, "Well, I've been called everything. I've been called Epstein, you name it, and I've been called it." But it really is Einstein, just like Albert.
Einstein. Okay.
Yeah,
There we go. I don't know why I thought that it was. I was almost going to say Einstein.
right. Well, of course, it was originally Einstein.
Einstein.
And it's so funny. In Hebrew, when I write it, I do write it with a shin, and it's Einstein. My daughter Jennifer, I have four kids. My daughter Jennifer, when she writes it in Hebrew, insists on not spelling it with a shin, but spelling it with a samach, because she says, "No, my name is Einstein, not Einstein." So what can you
God, I love it. Do you actually have any relation to Albert Einstein?
believe it or not? I've been asked this question almost on a daily basis as long as I can remember. We had a family tradition that we were distantly related. There was a story that when Albert Einstein actually arrived in America, that one of my great grandfather's brothers went to greet him at the ship and so forth. But that was like family legend. When my wife has been doing some genealogical work, and so have some other of our relatives, and we actually have determined that Albert Einstein and I have a common ancestor going back. So we actually are, I believe it's fifth cousin once removed. But so, I mean, we used to say 60th cousin, but that was a joke. But the answer is technically, I believe we are related.
Amazing. I'm going to guess that probably all Ashkenazi Jews are 60th cousins to each other,
Yeah,
probably a lot lower. There's,
that
an interesting genetic study was done a couple of years ago where I think a bunch of scholars detected that, all Ashkenazi Jews come from about, between 100 and 200 people that, ended up migrating north from, Africa at some point, probably 9th, 10th, 11th century, going up to Germany and then eventually there. So anybody here from the Ashkenazi community, including myself, who has, all the very classic, stomach aches and pains, we can all,
right. And it's very funny. Of course, having read my bio, that a large chunk of my interest over the years has been in the area of what we call outreach. I taught the community-wide introduction to Judaism class for 41 years. So almost all of the people that you meet in Orange County who are Jews by choice have been my students. I can't go anywhere that I don't run into former students. But the nice thing about this is I think that the numbers are maybe getting a little better for the next generation in terms of the Jewish genetic diseases, because having being married for so long, we know, as you say, Crohn's disease, it is the least of them, of course, the more serious ones, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, look, Jewish life is complicated, as you point out in every podcast.
No, I love it. And that's why, listen, I specifically married a Persian girl. So the two
I know.
communities have at least been separate for, 2,000 years. Let's actually start with that. Let's start with your, all these intro to Judaism classes and people who convert or Jew by choice. It's a very tough thing to craft an intro to Judaism syllabus or curriculum because Judaism is so vast. There's so many different facets. It's not quite a religion, not quite a culture, not quite an ethnicity. It just sort of, picks and chooses from all of these. And it's just like, how do you think about, when you were crafting that and, over your 40 years working with people who potentially wanted to join the Jewish people, if somebody comes in with, very little or zero knowledge, what is your first couple of conversations looking like?
Well, so those are a couple of different things, because the first thing is if somebody calls and expresses an interest in this, I will tell you, I've always approached phone calls in the following way: smile before answering the phone. I mean, it's something I learned many, many years ago. And it really, when you smile, and I do smile a lot, it comes very naturally to me. See, but if you're smiling, it does something internally. And so whenever somebody is calling me on the phone, I want to greet them in a positive and a welcoming way. And when I hear that it's somebody who's interested in Judaism, I give 100, truly 100%. I mean, I always try to give 100%, but here I really focus on this, because I know how hard that first call is. And what I want to do, I know that, we talk about the Jewish tradition of pushing people away 3 times. When I stand in judgment after 120 years, hopefully, I know that I will be challenged on this, that I will be addressed in the following way. Haven't you learned that you're supposed to challenge people and send them away three times? And I'll say, I stand guilty, because I believe that it's important to open our arms and welcome people. If it isn't the right place for them, you know what? That'll all, as we like to say, work out in the wash. It'll come out through their studies, through our discussions, and so on. And we've had people over the years, people who've come and expressed an interest and determined it wasn't the right thing for them. But to initially push people away, I feel is really the wrong way, especially because a lot of people have the wrong impression that the Jewish people is a closed corporation and you really can't enter, and that's not true. It's never been true, and it certainly is not true now. So I want people to feel that they are welcome. As far as the curriculum, that was really interesting. So I started teaching the class in 1976, September, first Monday of September, well, first Monday after Labor Day in 1976. And I was teaching it for a few years, and I got a call from Rabbi Irv Herman of blessed memory, who was the regional director of what was then called the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, now called the Union for Reform Judaism. We had regions in those days, we don't now. And he called me and said, because the class, the intro class, while it was sponsored by the Orange County Board of Rabbis here in Orange County, it was administered by the union. And so he said, I have this woman who's coming into me and telling me that, she took the intro course and, some time ago, she's Jewish. She had just gotten her master's from HUC, so she had been Jewish for a while. And she said, the intro courses are not teaching what people really need to know, because they teach about Judaism. That's not what people need when they're coming in. They don't want to learn about Judaism. They want to learn, how can I live as a Jew? That's a very different thing. And so one thing led to another. The person was Lydia Kukoff, who since became my writing partner and very dear friend now of decades. And Lydia became eventually the national outreach director for the Reform movement. But this was early on, and we gathered together a dozen rabbis and Jewish educators to create the curriculum. And we basically asked ourselves the question, what does somebody need to know in order to lead a Jewish life? So yes, they have to know about Judaism, but they also have to learn how to, allow me to make a verb out of this, how to Jew. And I don't mean this in the negative way that anti-Semites say. I mean this, how to live Jewishly. When Rabbi Herman put me together with Lydia, he thought that her emphasis was going to be the practical stuff, and I was going to be the theoretical person. In fact, it turns out we both shared the views that you need to have both, to use kind of technical terms, the cognitive and the affective. Both are equally important, and we needed to infuse both aspects into the curriculum. And the rabbis and educators that worked with us for a year on developing the curriculum had that same philosophy. And basically, the way we approached it was we used the Jewish holidays and the Jewish life cycle events. And we focused on on those things, but brought in the background, the history, the philosophy. But we didn't say, as prior courses did, all right, we're going to do 2 weeks on Jewish philosophy and 2 weeks on Jewish history, and etc. It was incorporated. So that's how we approached it.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, the role of Jewish philosophy in people that are potentially joining the Jewish people is always sort of an interesting one because Jews don't really have philosophy. And I say that as just someone, I just finished teaching a 10-week course on medieval Jewish philosophy. So I don't mean there haven't been Jews that have been philosophers philosophizing about Judaism, but there really are no standardized views. If you go into any synagogue, I mean, Orthodox, okay, fine, you'll probably have a higher percentage of people that agree on some general theologic construct, but as you of course know, but just for listeners, we don't really sit around with competing dogmatic visions of what heaven looks like and then at the end of the day vote on it and okay, this is the accepted creed of heaven, as a lot of other religious traditions do. We have thousands of years of debate about it, and then at the end of the day, I think Jewish practice errs on the side of okay, we're never going to know that, so focus on the things you can control, which is the everyday, as you said, the holiday, the life cycles, the day-to-day. I really love that anecdote of you going to heaven and being asked all those questions and then being tested on this. And I think it speaks a lot to the tension of modern day Jewish life with the sort of both inclusion, but also, I would say the departing from, traditional modalities of being Jewish. I'm trying to think how to craft this in real time. Obviously, for most of our history, being Jewish was a considerable detriment to one's life, right? So we can think of, really any time before the 20th century in most places in the world. Obviously, in the Christian world, things were, relatively awful for most of the time. That's, a generalization, but it holds true. In the Islamic world, things at times were slightly better, but Jews were still, dhimmis, second-class citizens. So converts were quite rare, right? Even in the story of, Megillat Ruth, which ends up being, the sort of prototypical convert story, a lot of people are shocked, right? When Ruth is talking to her, mother-in-law Naomi, she's like, what are you, crazy? You want to, go back to your people. There's nothing here for you. And, Ruth, of course, says, no, your people are my people and everything. Fast forward to, the 20th and 21st century, and I think this attests to, the duality of Jewish life, of sort of the benefit of general Jewish safety and security and prosperity within, America and everything like that, to the point where, assimilation goes up. And I don't necessarily mean that as a bad way. Obviously, if there's extreme anti-Semitism, there's no assimilation. So you always want some level of assimilation, because the opposite is, the Jews are probably not allowed to interact with wider culture. But this ends up creating a tension where Judaism is almost at risk of becoming just another, say, denomination of American Christianity. And I don't mean that in the, sense of, oh, what's the difference? But in the sense of, a lot of times, if people are, on a spiritual journey and trying to figure out exactly which, religious tradition works for them, it very much hasn't been a Jewish traditional thing to, oh, let's throw our, hat in the ring and try to figure out, oh, we also have these ideas. So I'm curious, how you think about that and how you wrestle with that just within this wider historic context. You can sort of take that wherever.
So a number of things. First of all, let me just say something to you, Daniel, and that is, I know this last year you were under some attack on the part of people who essentially were anti-Semitic, in my view. But it's very clear, just listening to you on these podcasts, and I know you have a lot of people who do follow you. What a wonderful teacher you are! Just the way you frame questions and everything, and what a great person you are to have on the campus, both in your working with students in that capacity and in your teaching capacity. And I want to say kol hakavod to you, and just be strong against anyone who raises a voice against you. Please know you have the community with you, behind you, and strengthening you. I want you to know that. So to address this, first of all, people in the class would ask me, what's the Jewish view of? And I would say, you can't really answer that. I can talk about what are the Jewish views on this subject. Let's say, for example, the afterlife. There isn't obviously just one view. And the whole question that you raised about assimilation and so on. It's interesting. I am a Reform rabbi. I have always been on the what we might call the more traditional side, and I often wonder exactly what's the difference between somebody who's on the traditional side of Reform and someone who's on the liberal side of conservative. You know, there's a bit of crossing over there, but in any case, from a Reform point of view, Reform rabbis, if you go back to let's say the late 19th century, the early 20th century, I think that they saw their role in many ways as helping to Americanize the Jews who had come here, because they were dealing with an immigrant population, and the whole idea was become a Yankee, you know, as best and as fast as you can. As we got into the late 20th century and now into the 21st century, we've looked and said, oh, we did such a great job at that, and now what we have to do is Judaize the Americans. Okay, so it's been quite a change, shall we say? If you look to our grandparents' generation, our great grandparents' generation, so much of they may not have been technically religious. If you ask them, "Are you religious?" Well, some would say yes, and many would say no. Particularly those who were trying so hard to Americanize, but Jewish culture was part of who they were, how they ate, how they talked, the jokes they told, and so on. Now you look at the Jewish students, Daniel, that you have on campus. How much different are they from the students on campus who aren't Jewish? Honestly, it's a tough job. Being a rabbi is tough in these days for many reasons. Look, as we always used to say in Yiddish, "Schwer zu sein a Yid," it's just hard to be Jewish. And we've discovered, particularly in the last year and a half, more than ever, how hard it is. I used to warn the students, both in class. We had two different sessions, one focused on Purim, one focusing on Yom HaShoah, where we talked about anti-Semitism. And certainly when I worked one-on-one with people who are converting, because that's part of it. It isn't just taking class, it's also working one-on-one typically with a rabbi, today sometimes with a cantor. And those discussions are, what's in the heart of the person sitting across the desk, or actually didn't sit across the desk, I sat one-on-one, very much closer to each other, didn't want a desk in the middle. But in any case, what's in the person's heart and what are their fears? And I always felt that we had and have a moral obligation, actually, to warn people that being Jewish is actually a dangerous thing, and today more so than ever. And I'll be very honest with you. Through most of my years of teaching, when I would talk about this, I honestly regarded it as kind of theoretical. I didn't really think it was all that dangerous to be Jewish. Yeah, was there such a thing as anti-Semitism? Of course, it's always been there. But we thought, well, it's mostly history. Now, guess what? It's not history at all. And we're facing it on a daily basis in so many different ways. So now we have to reiterate to people, and it's amazing. I have the privilege of sitting as part of a bet din for many people as they're converting. I'm still active in this work, but I'm the board chair of the Sander Kaplan Community Bet din of Southern California, which is a unique institution, the only one of its type that is welcoming people into the Jewish people, and the rabbis who were part of this represent all of the movement, shall we say, except we're not yet in days of Mashiach, so we don't have the Orthodox folks with us yet, but everybody else is there. So it's a multi-denominational, trans-denominational, post-denominational group. But in any case, sitting with the people today and at the Bet Din, once again, warning, if you will, the people, the response is heartening. People who say, we know this, we've seen it, we experience it, but this is who we are and this is where we need to be. And it's a wonderful experience for rabbis, a reminder of why we do what we do.
Yeah, and what you were saying about, just sort of these shifts in nature of what the reform movement was needed for in America, I'm sure, a lot of the 1880s reform thinkers would have either been smiling or rolling in their grave. It depends, probably who, to hear you talk about, Mashiach and the days of, and all of that within the context of reform Judaism changing. You touched on this a little bit, but in about 2 minutes, I'm going to ask you about, what the most salient differences you've seen of Jewish life in America in the last 50 years. Before that, I had just one anecdote. You had mentioned about, many of our, grandparents or great grandparents, the immigrants, they weren't quite religious, but they obviously breathed a deep sense of Jewishness in a way that's often missing now. I often think of this in the context of Israeli culture. I've had a lot of funny experiences. This is going to sound facetious, but I no longer trust Israelis when they tell me they're secular. Not in a bad way, but I remember my first year working for Hillel, we had a shaliach from, who came, he was joining us from Tel Aviv. And, he told me, and this is, mid-September when I met him, he's like, I know that you're, more religious, but I'm very secular. And I said, okay, great. I have plenty of friends that are, Jewish, not Jewish, secular, whatever. 3 days later, calls me up, Erev Rosh Hashanah. Daniel, where are you going for shofar tomorrow? I was like, I won't say his name. I thought you weren't religious. He's like, no, I'm not. But like, you need to hear shofar in Rosh Hashanah. I'm like, okay, fine. A couple of days later, Erev Rosh Hashanah that morning, get another call. Can I sleep over, tomorrow night? Sure. Why? Oh, I don't drive on Rosh Hashanah. I was like, okay. So, I found out this guy's not religious, would have been in probably the upper 10 percentile of religiousness for America. He just assumed religiousness meant, the ultra-Orthodox Haredim. You had mentioned, Orthodoxy, and, as my listeners know, and as you probably know, I have spent about the last 10 years caught between the world of, Orthodox Judaism and I'll say, liberal, AKA non-Orthodox Judaism. And, I very much in some ways feel at home at both and in some ways feel uncomfortable at both. I sort of, like to constantly have that. The issue that I probably spend the most time worried about, if people ask me what keeps me up at night, it's actually not anti-Semitism. It's not, what's happening in Israel that, keeps me up during the day. But at night, if I'm really thinking about, big questions, because I see this almost every day on campus, it's competing definitions of Jewishness between Orthodox and non-Orthodox. And I see this because of the immense hurt that a lot of students feel the first time, it's not news to anybody here that, Orthodoxy, maybe 40 years ago was much more insular in America than it is now. In the last 40 years, both because of Chabad's proliferation and also just because of the amount of money that mainstream Orthodox institutions have poured into, what they call kiruv, outreach. In other words, trying to get Jews who aren't Orthodox to become Orthodox. Now on almost, every suburban neighborhood or on every campus across the country, there's probably going to be a non-Orthodox Jewish institution and an Orthodox Jewish institution. And so people who have, their whole life not questioned their identity. I mean, why would you? You grow up in, X, Y, or Z synagogue, there's never a hint to the fact that your status might be questioned by others. People get to campus and are told, oh, actually you need X, Y, and Z to be Jewish. I had no idea, I know how to think about this on an individual level. I always affirm, the Jewishness of somebody, but on a societal level, what I'm seeing, and I really don't really see a way around this. I'm wondering if you have any good solutions. If you don't, it's totally fine. It just almost seems like between the Orthodox and non-Orthodox world, we're not only creating two different conceptions of Judaism, it's almost two completely different Jewish communities in terms of all these different definitions. What do we do with that in the most general sense? The more narrow sense, and then I'll let you address whichever one of these questions you want. You talked about the sort of age-old question. I think the Talmud first says it. Right before somebody converts, you tell them, don't the Jews are despised and hated and all of this, blah blah blah. And I have also in the few times I've worked with converts, the answer to that has always been astounding and incredible. At what time, or is it ever appropriate to talk about this issue? This question of if somebody's coming through a reform or a conservative baked in, to say, not in a derogatory sense, but in a, hey, just so if, you spend, I don't know, Shabbat in a couple weeks at a Chabad in X, Y, or Z, you might not be seen as halachically Jewish, even though, you're a part of the Jewish people? I mean, yeah.
So the answer is, yeah. Let me give me a few moments to kind of give you some history. The bottom line when I get there will be 100%. I always, always, always talk with people, not only when I was teaching the class, but certainly one-on-one about this question of authenticity. It's something that all people who are converting to Judaism are concerned about. Will I be seen authentically as a Jew? But it's very funny. Very often, we relate to a larger group by how we've been treated by an individual from that group. My first exposure to Orthodox Judaism was when I was about 14 years old, and my best friend lost his father. His father had a heart attack and died. And so the next weekend, every weekend we lived in the San Fernando Valley. We used to go visit my grandparents who lived in the Fairfax area. And so I said to my friend, well, come along with me. And we went. And then in the afternoon, we were walking around the neighborhood, and we came to a place that was called, the name of it had an English name, the Institute of Living Judaism. It had a Hebrew name too. It was an Orthodox shul. It was really a kind of a Hasidic shtibel. And I said, let's walk in. So we went in, and it was just before Mincha time. The rabbi with this long beard was giving a shiur in Yiddish. The only word I could understand of the shiur was Mitzrayim, which was Hebrew, right? Fine, he finished the shiur. It's time to daven mincha. Fine, the guys start davening. And we get to Kaddish. And my friend knew his father had died. He was supposed to stand up and say Kaddish. He didn't have the benefit of even a basic Hebrew school education. He was Jewish, but, culturally. But he knew he was supposed to stand up. He stands up. And the siddur that they used did have a transliteration for the Kaddish. So he's, trying to sound out. It's Ashkenazi, right? Yiskadal, the Yiskad. And the men start screaming at him, louder, louder. We have to be able to say amen. Say it louder. That was my first experience. It wasn't a positive experience. We walked out of the place. I said, they called this the Institute of Living Judaism. This looks like the Institute of Dead Judaism. That's my first experience. Years later, I was an undergraduate at UCLA, and a number of my closest friends were modern Orthodox Jews. And all of a sudden, guess what? I saw these lovely people who were completely accepting of me and so on. They didn't agree with exactly how I lived my Jewish life, but we were all Jews together, right? So I had a very positive. I now, and through the years, have gone to all kinds of shuls and can appreciate every kind of service, honestly. And I'm traditionally inclined, so I like the more traditional service, all right? As a matter of fact, when we began B'nai Tzedek after our first year, the next 6 or more years, we had our Sunday morning classes at the Hebrew Academy, Lubavitch. And I have maintained a close relationship with the Chabad rabbis through all these years and so on. So, that's where I am as far as that goes. However, there's been a big difference that you noted. 50 years ago, Orthodoxy was in decline in America. And clearly the more, the conservative and the reform movements were the dominant forms. It has dramatically changed now, for many reasons and more than the ones you mentioned. And so now there is a concern that there's going to be a real split. We love to say the old UJA motto, we are one. That motto was "We are one!" exclamation point. And now we probably should say we are one and end it with a question mark, right? Yeah, I worry about it as well. I think we have to work at bridging the gap because we are one in one regard, and that is the people out there who hate us. They don't care how often we go to shul. They don't care what kind of synagogue we pray in or if we pray. None of that matters to them. And so ultimately, we do need to work together, to stick together. And if we're open enough, as I think both you and I are, it is to learn to appreciate what all the groups, each and every one of these Jewish groups, have to offer. They all have strengths, they all have weaknesses. Even if we're identified with one, we can see the weaknesses in our own as well as in the others. So, those are my thoughts on it.
No, I totally agree. And I think, there's been a lot written about a lot of this, discussion about how I think strict denominationalism is anyway on the decline for something that's a lot more fuzzy. You had mentioned the sort of flip in the last 50 years of, again, you read articles from, interestingly enough, both America and also, pre-state Palestine of, orthodoxy and the predictions were, this is the infamous, Ben Gurion deal with the Haredim that I think is still plaguing Israel now, just to unpack it for listeners, one of the biggest debates in Israel is over the ultra-Orthodox fighting in the army. And when Ben Gurion originally signed that, it was in, 1947 because he wanted to get ultra-Orthodox support for Zionism, which of course the ultra-Orthodox were predisposed to be anti-Zionist. That's a whole separate conversation. So he said, okay, fine. You can, if you can exist in the state, you can get all the benefits, but you don't have to, have all the quote unquote costs, aka serving in the military. At that time, I, haven't looked at the numbers in a while, but I think it was, hundreds, maybe a couple of thousand, Haredi yeshiva boys. Now all of a sudden that number has gone up exponentially. Now it's probably between 10 and 20% of the Israeli public is Haredim. So it's a huge debate, but, it really just goes into this shift of orthodoxy from being this, within one or two generations, especially in America, especially with modernity, that'll sort of go down. I'm curious, why, if you can play, armchair sociologist for a while. I mean, why is it the case, because as somebody in my life who has actually moved from orthodoxy to, for lack of a better term, pluralistic or liberal Jewish community, and I think, modernity, both in terms of what we are learning about the world intellectually and what we are, I'll say learning about the world, in terms of, ethics and morality, for me, the move away from orthodoxy, I think made a lot of sense with my expanded understanding of, say, how the world works. I don't have to get into more details, but it seems like for the mainstream, the opposite's happening. So I'm curious, from your vantage point, I mean, why is it the case that now orthodoxy is on the up and, reform and conservative are seemingly on the down?
I think that this actually is mirroring what we're seeing in other religious communities as well. The mainstream Protestant denominations have been losing large numbers of people. Of course, the second largest religious group in America are former Catholics, right? So people who've left that church. And the religious institutions that are grabbing people are those that are more fundamentalist, evangelical, where here are the answers. People are looking for answers, and they're open to definite answers. The more liberal approaches to religion give people lots of choices and say, look, you can look at it this way, you can look at it this way. You have to use your own judgment and use your own sense of morality and your own conscience and blah, blah, blah. And people want to be told this is right and this is wrong and so on. And in uncertain times, I think that they are drawn to that. It's very interesting. My wife and I met at UCLA, and we began as study partners, and now have married 57 years. We married right out of college. We're again study partners. We are, what is it now? 3/4 of the way through Daf Yomi. We've started this cycle and have been doing it every day for now more than 5 years. And we keep asking the question, and it's hard to, you probably would know because you came out of that yeshiva world, and that is, I've studied the text and I've studied Talmud before. And by the way, I don't think Daf Yomi is the ideal way to study Talmud. We're like skimming the surface as fast as we can, as opposed to, I mean, I took a class in Talmud. We would do 10 blot in a semester, and now we do it in 10 days. I mean, that's a little crazy, right? But
Yeah, just to translate for listeners who might not be familiar with Daf Yomi. Daf Yomi literally means a page a day, but it's a program to you finish the entirety of the Talmud in about 7.5 years by doing a double-sided page every day. But it's not a page of I don't know, reading Harry Potter. This is it's like a page of reading dense legal proceedings, and so yes.
And it's we keep asking the question. I can't get and don't want to get past my training. If you were trained in a liberal seminary or in a university, and we have both because we were Hebrew majors at UCLA, so we had that Jewish studies approach, and then an HUC approach, and you would get the same thing if you went to Ziegler or Jewish Theological Seminary, etc. And that is a critical approach of the text. Just because it says this doesn't mean it. And the idea is, I guess, the blacker the hat are the people more likely to simply take it at face value. And here we're studying with Rabbi Steinsaltz, who was one of the great Jewish minds, I believe, of our lifetime, right? And with somebody like Rabbi Steinsaltz or Rabbi Sachs, the late chief rabbi of Britain, and so on. These were brilliant, worldly, educated people, secularly educated. Would they take it at face value also? Or do they study it in the same manner that I was trained to study it? And that is, all right, what were the circumstances? Who were the people? And so on, not just so they would read back into biblical times as if these, the kings were also yeshiva bochum, and they really weren't. We know they weren't.
No, it's hard to know. I think it's a really interesting question, and I think the Orthodox world is sort of torn on this. I'll give a couple of examples, right? So, probably a lot of listeners are familiar with the story in, Genesis. I believe it's Genesis 18. Somebody could fact check me when, Abraham is sitting in his tent and visited by the three messengers, aka angels that come. And, Abraham, of course, prepares a nice meal of milk and lamb, right? Something that is, textbook not kosher, right? He's effectively serving them cheeseburgers. So, most normal, I think, people reading the Torah say, okay, the book of Exodus, where the, first elucidation of, meat and milk is hinted to, is not for, hundreds of years. So fine. But there are probably 1,000 pages of Jewish legal discussion in the last 2,000 years of how Abraham was allowed to do this, again, with that assumption. I've always been torn, and, especially when I was in, the yeshiva world, is this just a metaphor? Like, meaning, is this just a thought experiment that Abraham was, keeping the entirety of halacha and all of this? Or do people really believe this? And my suspicion is within the Orthodox world, it's sort of torn. I would guess somebody like Adin Steinsaltz and Jonathan Sachs would both be on the, it's metaphor side. But I also, because something that I've noticed about myself, I've shared a little bit of this in past podcasts, but, one of the things that I think, was my initial, nudge out of the Orthodox world was coming into contact with ancient Jewish history and doing exactly what you're saying. Instead of approaching the Torah as in the Orthodox world, this is, of course, verbatim, God, Mount Sinai, handing it to Moses and writing it down, and it's perfect, studying it more critically, okay, what was happening with the politics of the time? What was happening with the other nations of the time? Is it possible that if the book of Genesis has two different stories with three details missing, were these actually just two different traditions, right? So all of those, big picture questions, which eventually, when I said before in terms of intellectual, I got to a point where I was just, okay, it's no longer intellectually honest for me to stay in the Orthodox community and all of that. But still, when I come back to studying Torah, if I'm going to give a, shiur or a parsha, a sermon at shul, I'm never going to the source critical, meaning, I would almost never say, oh, this interesting question, that's actually because that's the E source versus the J source. I'll say, here's Rashi's view, here's the Midrash's view. And so I think within what I'll call the more intellectually, Orthodox world, the modern Orthodox world, I think the study of Talmud is sort of more that, meaning, there's this is to quote, Joseph Soloveitchik. I'll give another fun case study here that I think really divides the modern Orthodox community from the Orthodox community. This is very much insider baseball here. But the Talmud, when talking about the laws of Shabbat, one of the laws of Shabbat that you're not allowed to do is you're not allowed to kill an animal, right? So it's one of the malachot because it's too close to the ritual slaughtering of the animals in the temple. So, for anybody out there on Shabbat, one of the things you can't do, kill animals. The Talmud also, for a variety of historic reasons, thought that lice, right, the lice you get in your hair and clothing, were not actually living creatures, right? The Talmud didn't, again, I don't think anybody, 1800 years ago knew that. So this creates this question where the Talmud actually says you're allowed to kill lice on Shabbat. Fast forward 1800 years, we know that lice are just as living as, I don't know, spiders and flies and, mice and whatever. Are you allowed to kill lice on Shabbat? So a more ultra Orthodox person would say, of course you are, right? Lice must actually not be living, even if it's a facade that we are. The more modern Orthodox community, in the community that I grew up in, Joseph Soloveitchik, who wrote this very influential book, Halachic Man, what he would essentially say, I don't know if he commented on this specific case, but that there is material reality and then there's sort of an idealistic halachic reality. And within halachic reality, which is a construct to a large extent, you're not allowed, you are allowed to kill lice. Within material reality, okay, it's probably best not to. And so I think, it is based on that bifurcation of when you're approaching the text, when you're engaged in Jewishness, you're doing it almost with, the same way. The example that I always give when explaining the Orthodox, or at least this conception of the Orthodox world, is if me and you were going to play a game of basketball, let's say, we all know I can probably run faster across the court if I don't dribble, but yet that would sort of ruin the game. And it's not for any, and it wouldn't help for me to sit down before we started the game of basketball and was like, it really would make more sense if we can just run, because then that wouldn't be basketball. So I suspect the same is true, with learning Jewish sources through a critical lens and not. It's just a different thing, right? Like sometimes you just want to play basketball. And then other times, if we're sitting around with our intellectual hats on, we can say, maybe this rule should be changed. And I think, that could be an interesting difference.
And we actually are seeing this funny example, a wonderful example that in some of the sports the last couple of years, they have looked at things and said, it would make this game better if we changed it. And then you get the traditionalists say, well, you're ruining our game. And others saying, well, it really makes sense. So that's it. The wonderful thing, just again, Daniel, looking at you, is so often people who are in the Haredi community, particularly, when they determine that isn't the right community, they're lost, and they more or less give up Jewish life. They're culturally Jewish or whatever, but they can't find another place. And you have been able to find other places, both within the Orthodox world and in the non-Orthodox world. That's a good thing. It saddens me when I know of people who have left the Haredi world but haven't been able to find their place within Judaism today.
Yeah, no, I think it is. So I grew up in the modern Orthodox community, which I think was a huge plus. There's, it's funny because, you obviously understand this, but just for, if there are listeners that aren't from an Orthodox background, a lot of people think, oh, Orthodox is Orthodox. Whereas, for me growing up, the difference between modern Orthodox and ultra Orthodox was, might as well have been as big as from modern Orthodox to Reform, just in terms of the conception. Even just, I think the New York Times a couple of years ago published this article about the school system in New York and how, there are these yeshivot in New York that are not even teaching English. They're only teaching Yiddish because, and again, this is a conscious move on the ultra-Orthodox schools' part of, being, anti-assimilation to the point of, if kids don't know English, they're going to be a lot less likely to come across ideas that conflict with Judaism. And so, it is, I think, a very interesting split. I think the modern Orthodox community ends up being caught right in the middle of everything you're talking about. The same way I think it's harder to be a liberal Jew now because everybody's caught between the, quote unquote, the nuns, right? People that have no specific religious denomination or more fundamentalism, the same way politically, it's probably harder to be a centrist. Modern Orthodoxy also has a little bit of that where, a lot of my friends growing up modern Orthodox, many have sort of, not left Judaism, but just, their Jewish practice is more traditional, shall we say. They'll have Shabbat, but like without any serious, oh, Shabbat, we have to do this and we can't do this and whatever. And then other friends of mine that have moved more into the like yeshivish, community there. I know we've been talking for a while, and there's one other sort of thread that I wanted to talk about, which is this moment in history for Jews. We've alluded to, the last 2 years and this inflection point. I'm always of two minds of this thing, and I'm reminded there's a very famous essay by a man named Simon Rabinowitz about 100 years ago called Jews the ever dying people, and he sort of talks about how at every stage of life Jewish leaders have always said, oh my God, there's some major changes happening due to either Jews becoming less Jewish or, anti-Semitism growing. This is going to be the last generation of Jews unless we do this drastic change. So I often have that in the back of my mind when I think about the current moment we're in. So part of me says, is this just our version of, oh my God, it seems that America, both forces on the right and the left, it seems, the place of Jews within, again, the mainstream, capital L liberals where most Jews have been, throughout history, it seems like that place, that middle is crumbling. So part of me thinks, oh, this is just another, ever dying people. And part of me is like, oh my God, we should take this very seriously. I'm curious where you sort of align within that spectrum.
Well, I have to say that the more I know you, the more I see how similar we are. And I feel pretty much the same way. It depends on the day. Okay. I will tell you, I walk down the halls of Congregation B'nai Tzedek, where I've been retired since 2012, but it's still my community. And on the walls are the pictures of our confirmation classes. We would have the students at the end of the 10th grade, they would have a ceremony and so on. We had their class pictures up there. And I walk and I walk and I walk and I wonder, as I'm looking at them, how many of these kids, now those kids understand, some of them are now in their 60s and some of them are in their 30s. How many of them are leading any kind of Jewish life? They did when they were teenagers to some extent, but what about now? And what about the next generation? What are they doing if they have children? What are they doing with those children? And it's mixed. I will tell you. I mean, some of them I know that they are doing nothing. Some of them I know are actually quite actively Jewish, and a lot of them I don't really know, but I worry about. I will say that post October 7th, plus the kind of anti-Semitism we're seeing, I think has shown again this terrible line. We know this terrible, I hate it. I hate this line. We know it. When it's good for Jews, it's bad for Judaism. When it's bad for Jews, it's good for Judaism. I hate that, but to some extent, it seems to be true. There are people who were, Jewish, quote, what we call just Jewish. And all of a sudden they're saying, I'm more than just Jewish. I'm doing something. I'm now wearing a Star of David. I'm now going to synagogue. I'm now reading Jewish books, etc. So I wouldn't give up. I don't think we're dying, but I am concerned too, because for all those who are living the Jewish life or coming back, I know that there are a lot of them who aren't bothering. And for all the people that, I've been so involved in Kiruv of outreach, bringing people in, and we've done wonderful things with that. But, we've also lost people, not usually to other religions, but to nothing. No religion and no culture either. I don't care if somebody calls himself religious. I mean, like you said, with the guy from Israel, and people say all kinds of things about themselves. The question is, I'll look at you and I'll have more of a sense of, if you're really living any kind of a Jewish life just by what you're doing. Because, as we both agree, for us, the essence isn't what you say you believe, it's what you're doing. Are you living anything in terms of Jewish values? So I don't know. It's a big question mark, and only the future will tell. But
yeah, it was funny when you were talking about. Oh, sorry, go for it.
I do think we are the eternal people, so I don't think we're going out of business. At least I hope not.
Yeah, no, I agree. No, it's funny when you were talking about UCLA because I also went to UCLA and met my
Yeah.
wife at UCLA. And I remember, when I was there, the then Rabbi Chaim Saderfeller, who I became very close with, he always, said that there's, in your life, there's going to be two types of teachers or two types of rabbis. One standing on one side saying, come to me, I have all the answers, and then the other one saying, come to me, I have all the questions, and you should always
Right.
go to the one with the questions. So I appreciate you not giving any direct answers and also leading with questions. I have one more specific question for you. Then, if there's anything we didn't address that you want to discuss, feel free. You've been very vocal against the sort of, I think, knee-jerk reaction, what I'll define it, of a lot of Jews to a lot of the Trump policies that seem like they're protecting Jews. So I don't know if you want to touch on that. I mean, what might you say to somebody that's looking at a lot of policies now and saying, I get why this could be the beginning of a slippery slope, but like in this very narrow sense of, say, the deportations of anti-Israel students or cracking down on colleges, if somebody's saying, hey, at the end of the day, in my life, that makes me a little bit safer. I mean, how would you, I know that your, Facebook has, in the last month has been full of these conversations, but I'd love for you to touch on that just a little bit.
Um, I'm torn, very honestly. Okay. I don't like the people who have been harassing Jews on campus. Uh, I I I do care about Palestinian people. I do care about them, but I care about Israel and its survival and its safety. Okay, um, and I believe that so many of the people who are called pro-Palestinian are actually more anti-Israel than pro-Palestinian. And this last weekend kind of showed it, where here the Hamas basically were harassing, even killing people who have stood up against them, Palestinians who want a free Palestinian place. And none of these people on campus are saying a word about that. That, as far as I've seen, maybe you're saying something. I haven't seen anything about it. So, what are they really all about? So, no. Are we safer when these people aren't around harassing people like Daniel? Yeah, we are safer. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, the first thing I get up in the morning, I do my stretches and my exercise, and I put on the news, right? What's the first thing that I heard today? That a man, a resident of Maryland, was picked up by ICE and was taken away and has been sent to that infamous prison in El Salvador. And then the government discovered, oops, it was the wrong guy. This guy wasn't guilty of anything. And then they said, but sorry, we can't do anything about it because he's now in the control of a different country. So it's beyond our help. Really? Um, I'm sorry. I think that the people currently in power, when they say make America great, again, they mean make it that white, cisgender, male controlled place that it used to be, when it was very far from great for a lot of people. So I worry about it. Uh, they use things in a manipulative fashion. This is, to me, a perfect example. They hate academia, and they're doing whatever they can to undermine it, and they're using this as the reason. Once again, the Jews now are going to get blamed by both sides, as usual. So, nope, I don't trust them at all. I really don't. But having said that, if there's somebody who's been harassing Daniel on campus and there's a way of getting him off campus that's legal, I'm not going to cry, and I am going to cry. So those things keep me up.
No, I think that's very right, and I think I've been shocked at, because I've also been torn, but I've been shocked at the people in the Jewish community that have been so supportive of Trump that they're not afraid or concerned at all. Just confuses me because, the basic rules-based order of, capital L liberalism in America has just been really good for Jews, right? All throughout at least modern history, countries that have try to pick and choose winners based off of ethnic background, or countries that have tried to go, to the right in terms of populism or to the left in terms of populism. It just has never, it's always ended badly for Jews. And the only thing that's really benefited Jews and really worked in the diaspora, which is why I think, Jews in America have had such a, really a great time despite, okay, a couple of, troughs, but really it's been the best time to be a Jew anywhere in history, outside of Israel. And, arguably, this might upset people even today that Israel does exist. It might be, better in some ways to be in America. So yeah, I don't know. I think it is just a sense of tunnel vision. And again, I think the tension that you're laying out there is, I think, the tension that I think I'm feeling also, which is, okay, on the one hand, in this very limited, narrow sense, maybe I'll sleep better for the next week, but then, this is easily a slippery slope that I think, probably isn't worth, by any stretch of the imagination, what could potentially happen. So I totally agree with you there. I know we've been talking for a while. Any other, either about this or just in general Judaism, your life, what have we not touched?
Well, I think that I would like to say, you used the word before, centrist. There are probably people who, especially if I have a lot of people who follow me on Facebook and who probably think I'm some kind of leftist. I'm not. I describe myself as probably both religiously and politically as center left. In other words, lean a little on the left side, but really mostly in the center. And I think that's a good place to be. The center. It's kind of like Maimonides, the golden mean, or like Kohelet. Don't be over righteous and don't be too much of a sinner either. I remember when I first studied that in a Bible course at UCLA with Dr. David Lieber of blessed memory, and it's kind of shocking at first that in the Bible it actually says don't be overly righteous. But you know what? That middle ground. I think that anti-Semitism, whether it comes from the left or from the right, is equally dangerous to us. I think, as you said, the populism on the right or the left is dangerous to us. It has been much better for us when things are in the middle. And that's very worrisome because right now, politically and religiously, it seems like the extremes are the ones who are in power. And those of us who are in the center are buffeted, from various directions. So it's a hard time now. And even though I'm technically retired, and my wife says the only thing I seem to have retired from is a paycheck, but I'm still pretty active out there. I see my role of essentially being supportive to people like you, Daniel, and to our other colleagues who are out there doing the work with the people and so on, and trying to support people in the best way I can, because it's just hard now. It's hard to be a Jew. It's hard to be an American, and it's hard to just be living in our world. And so I think people of high moral standards need to strengthen each other.
Well, very much appreciate the conversation. Thank you so much, Rabbi Stephen Einstein. I got the last
Good.
name right this time.
Thank you. My pleasure to be with you today.